And hello again. Hi, this is Catalyzing the Future, Catalyzing Conversations with Todd Nilson and Cy Alhir. Hello, Cy. How are you today?
I'm doing well, my friend. How are you?
Doing very well, thanks. We're marching down the road of doing more of these fascinating interviews with so many thought leaders from across the globe, and we've got another great guest with us here today. Do you want to give a quick teaser about Richard?
Definitely. So Richard is I'll let him introduce himself once he gets in here, but definitively one of the key attractive points for me was in really stumbling upon Richard is the degree of dimensionality that he brings into his thinking. So a lot of corners, a lot of vantage points to explore, and the journey and the conversation should be very interesting. So I've been looking forward to this conversation here.
I'm very excited to hear more. I haven't had an opportunity to have a conversation with him except just briefly in the green room before we came on the air here. But it's very exciting to have him on. I did see the deck that you had forwarded me with some of his thinking, so I'm eager to hear a little bit more in his own words about that. But first, before we invite him into the channel here, just a quick blurb for everybody. You have arrived at the Catalyzing the Future channel, either on YouTube or Facebook, and we would ask humbly that if you enjoy the content here, that you please like it, share it, comment on it with others. And we will regularly keep posting up content here. The next big event that we have coming up is going to be micro workshop, a day of learning. Actually, micro workshops in the plural, a day of learning on December the 9th. And these are 90-minute sessions of intense practical learning opportunity for individuals and organizations. If you are a leader, for your organization, if you are an entrepreneur, if you are a coach, if you are a professional just looking to improve yourself, I think there is a great deal to be gleaned from participating in this day of events. I think we've got 3 separate tracks so far, and multiple workshops for each one of those tracks. So if you are interested, if your curiosity is piqued, and I hope that it is, you can find out more about it by going to catalyzingthefuture.com. You can find it there, as well as links are going to lead you over to Eventbrite, where you can actually sign up for the event. So that being said, what do you say we go ahead and get started here, Cy?
Sounds excellent, my friend. Let's do that.
All right, I'm going to invite Richard into the channel here. Richard, welcome.
Thank you.
It's so good to see you.
It's fantastic seeing both yourself and Cy as well.
Now, what part of the world are you in, Richard?
So I'm based in Sydney, Australia. I've lived here for over 20 years, and it's as you can see, it's sort of mid-morning here. It's a beautiful sunny day, and this time of the year is gorgeous in Sydney. You start having these warmer days. The jacaranda trees come out, and summer's just around the corner. So it's a wonderful time of the year.
I don't even know what a jacaranda tree is. I'm going to have to look it up when we get off the call here. But that's wonderful. It looks like a beautiful day. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your morning to join us. Cy had just briefly shared some information with me before we got on the call, a deck called Skills for a Quantum World, The Complexity Void. I don't know if Cy has some more specific questions to kind of tee things off, but I'm curious. I'd like to learn a little bit more about your approach here.
And curious is the key word. Before you start off, Richard, and going deeper, I have to say, so I stumbled upon Richard, and since stumbling upon you, and I mentioned this very directly before, Richard, I have been captivated by the amount of integration that's going into your thinking, and I think the world really can benefit from hearing your voice. So with that backdrop, I'll just listen for a bit.
Certainly, and thanks for that, Cy. Just to give the audience some perspective, I spent over 20 plus years working in institutional banking and corporate banking. My undergraduate sort of qualifications are in commerce and accounting and finance. And what sort of struck me during that period was that if you think about banking and finance, it's all about risk. And what risk is all about is how do we sort of make sense of uncertainty, or how do we make sense of that complexity? And, the big breakthrough in the risk was, I think, in the 16th and 17th century in Florence in Italy, when you had a whole bunch of statisticians looking at the number of boats coming back from the Middle East and China, and quantifying that and putting a number out of that on that to quantify that uncertainty. And that really was the birth of modern day finance and the insurance sector. And it sort of fueled the industrial revolution and the digital revolution that we've had. What's, however, struck me during that period was that looking at the world through the lens of uncertainty, to me, it's a core axiom of reality. So the way I see reality is that there's really three core axioms. There's complexity, there's uncertainty, which is a function of that complexity, but also a function of what I call the adjacent possible, which is a term that came out of Professor Stuart Kauffman from the US. And the third element is the human condition. So our capacity or our ability to try to understand that complexity. Yet we've created a society that wants certainty, wants simplicity, and wants knowing. And it's almost the antithesis of the world that we inhabit. The other point I would say about this is that when we talk about reality, for the last 300 plus years, our perception of reality has been shaped by René Descartes, who sort of came up with this idea that to think, I think, therefore I am, which is a very much a mental way of looking at reality. He also came to the conclusion that it wasn't just about thinking, there was also the experience in the world. He embraced the Leibniz law to come up with this sort of Cartesian dualism. And where I think this has sort of come apart is that we see these two ideas as discrete, when the reality is that they're actually interdependent and interconnected. And what struck me about a lot of the way that we're structuring society at the moment is that it's based off what I call an algorithmic mind, which is all about certain models of the world, simplicity, coming up with heuristics. And in a lot of cases, those ways of looking at reality are moving further and further away from reality. So we're ending up with this mirror world. And whether that's, if I look at the global financial system, the increasing social imbalances, our relationship with the natural world, there's a number of complex, dynamic, multidimensional areas where this sort of dualism or this materialism way of looking at reality is insufficient to make sense of that. And what I'm very passionate about and what the complexity void's all about is starting to sort of think more in terms of an integrated way of thinking. And there's been a number of people that have heavily influenced that thinking. The first individual is a 20th century US philosopher, the Aristotle of modern times, a gentleman by the name of Charles Sanders Peirce. He's one of three really important pragmatist philosophers that came out of the US in the early part of the 20th century. The other two are William James, who's the parent of modern day neuroscience and psychology, and John Dewey, who's the parent of modern day education and civic engagement. And what these three philosophers had in common was that they started with our experience in the world, not with some sort of abstract idea of the world. And their whole way of sort of thinking was shaped by action and perception in the world, not through a statistical p-value or an algorithm or a model of the world, but in our experience in the world. And through that, they then developed heuristics and ways of thinking about the world. But in some cases, those models had to be updated on a regular basis. So a lot of what Charles Sanders Peirce has done has reimagined what logic would be and has reimagined what reason would be. And he actually has three dimensions to that. And the first dimension is through abduction. And abduction is through our real world experience. It's through those interrelationships and interdependencies that we make sense of the world. And that could be through physical objects, ontology, It could also be through epistemology, knowledge, or it could be through axiology, which is our values and ethics. But it's through that way of trying to make sense of the world that we then come up with heuristics. So he talked about abduction, he talked about induction, and he talks about deduction. And it feels to me that for the last 2,000 years, what we've done, we've embraced what I call an Aristotelian way of looking at the world, which is through deduction. And we haven't had a reflexivity mechanism to compare that against the material world. So we end up with this incredible cognitive dissonance. And what's now emerging is with artificial intelligence. And I actually have a fundamentally different view on what artificial intelligence really is. And I'm happy to share that later in this interview. But I think what we need to do is take more of an integrated way, and we need to sort of connect our real world with our world of thoughts. So moving beyond materialism, idealism, to an integrated way of seeing the world. And, you know, Jean Gebser, who was a European linguist and philosopher of the 20th century, had a theory of consciousness, and he spoke about the need to shift from what he calls a mental structure way of looking at the world, which is all about our minds, to an integrated way, which is about our mind, body, and our agency in the world. And that's a fundamental shift. It's a bit like Copernicus when he said the Earth revolves around the sun. There's a lot of existing interests that want to sort of preserve the current way that we view reality. So this is a very interesting time, and it really challenges to the core how we perceive the world. And I think it's really exciting, but it really requires us to be courageous enough to move beyond what I call the ego state to listening to different perspectives and embracing a new way of seeing the world.
That's a great picture to paint. So thank you for that, Richard, all around. You know, the immediate question that comes to my mind is, if I say and I'm asking this as a question, have people embraced a reductionist point of view as a defense mechanism just throughout the journey that we've gone through, and that degree of fragmentation that it's caused at this point? Are we now really confronting the void due to all that fragmentation and that reductionist sort of point of view?
I think we are, and I thought sort of deeply around why we would sort of embrace a reductionist view, and there's actually some logic and rhyme and reason to doing so. You know, if the world is complex and uncertain, what we're trying to do is create a level of certainty and stability in that world. And like everything in a quantum world, there's paradox between certainty and uncertainty, between complexity and simplicity. So it's you know, part of this is moving away from this sort of binary classical way of seeing the world as right or wrong or so forth, and looking at it more as a dualistic way of looking at it, accepting that there's paradoxes in reality. But what reductionism and algorithmic thinking and p-values in science and a whole bunch of things do is they create a level of order and stability. But if you don't update your models of the world or your algorithms based off your experience in the world, your mental structure of the world moves further and further away from the world. So you end up in places like a virtual reality or a mirror world or a singularity where intelligence is just all about computation, mm-hmm. or a desire to go to Mars because we can't address the issues within our planet. So there is a role for algorithms and heuristics, and it drove the scientific revolution. But what we need to recognise is that there's limits to that type of thinking. There's the need to accept that there are things that we simply will never know. So we need to develop things like negative capability, being comfortable with uncertainty and complexity. And we also need to ensure that our heuristics and models and theories are being perpetually updated based off our experience of reality. Because reality, this is one of the other big shifts I see, is that reality is not digital or discrete, it's analog, it's a flow, it's emergent, it's perpetually changing. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about the world. I mean, in a world of flow, time no longer exists because it's just a flow. It's a series of interrelationships and so forth. So that to me is the key. And to do that, we need reflexivity. And what humans have that no other animal has is the ability, it's called second order cybernetics, but the capacity to reflect on itself and to try to make sense of the world. You know, there's a wonderful book that's just come out in the last 2 years by a UK neuroscientist, philosopher, Raymond Tallis, called Logos, The Mystery of How We Make Sense of the World. And the fact that despite all the complexity of reality, we can still come up with a view of the world is just an amazing trait that humans have got. And I've got this sort of theory, and it's based off Charles Sanders Peirce, that it's based off our capacity to build this high-dimensional semantic structure of reality that connects both our mental world and our material world, and it enables emergence. And there's a wonderful phrase in Zulu history within South Africa, and this phrase talks about a person is a person through other people. So it's that interconnection and interdependency that gives us meaning, whether it's through our experience in the natural world or our relationships or our ideas. And it's, as I mentioned to you the other day, one of the great breakthroughs with the internet, and it came out with both Tim Berners-Lee and Larry Page and Sergey Brin, was shifting the way that we think about knowledge from a library or a book to an emergent semantic network. So at the core of Google's success was the idea of the PageRank algorithm. And what the PageRank algorithm does that Yahoo never could do was that it measured and assessed the relationship between different items, whether it's ontology or epistemology. It looked at the relationship of those. It didn't simply just store them all in a catalogue or in a library book. So it was dynamic. And it overcame the fundamental issue that Yahoo was experiencing, was that their library was getting larger and larger and larger as the internet grew. And the whole experience started breaking down because they didn't have the capacity to reflect the emergent nature of the internet. And that goes to the core of Google's success. So this idea of thinking of the world rather than in an algorithmic way, but as in an emergent semantic way, anchored in the material world, but connecting our material world with our inner world. And as a society, we're not sharing this this dualism, these two different ways of seeing reality. When was the last time we had a conversation around some of these areas? So I actually think areas like philosophy are central to this. And my understanding is that at the leading military colleges in the US, at West Point, the only compulsory subject is philosophy. Yeah. Because it gives you those inner development capacities to make sense of that emergent reality.
Yeah, the same thing in Silicon Valley, actually, exactly to that point, Richard. Philosophers are sought after in many circles, so definitively. I want to ask you, Richard, one of the phrases that immediately comes to mind is, the more connected we are through our technology, the more isolated we feel in many different ways. And exactly as you're saying, the ability to reflect, if you will, and have that reflexivity and be aware of what's going on. How, for lack of any other words, how do we break through the veil that we're creating ourselves around us?
I think it will just be. I've written an article, a series of articles I've written on Medium about all these areas, and I would actually argue that the thing that will drive us to break through this veil is the survival instinct. That to survive, we need to accept the state of the material world. We are interdependent and interconnected. So, if you think about the global financial system, we can sort of come up with these new ideas and whether it's post-Keynesian, Keynesianism or neoclassical economics and talk about how money has no connection to reality, that we can just print money, or there's MMT, or there's cryptocurrencies.
Mm-hmm.
There's no nexus between that sort of abstract idea and reality. You end up in this sort of mirror world. And at some point, Franz Kafka, wonderful quote, goes along the lines of, in a fight between yourself and reality or the real world will win every time.
Yeah.
So I think there's an innate survival instinct. And, what I would like to stress is that science and deduction and traditional Aristotelian logic has given us incredible benefits in the scientific revolution, the digital revolution, a huge amount of knowledge, but there's also limitations of that way of thinking. And there's so much we could learn from Peirce's view, Charles Sanders Peirce's view of taking more of an integrated approach between abduction, induction, and deduction, but also at the same time recognize the limits of reason. Because Hannah Arendt talks about how reason, the search for reason is really a search for meaning.
Mm-hmm. There's two questions that come to my mind. I want to put them out there together and kind of have you sort of see where you take us with this. And I've asked this question actually of other guests as well. Is the COVID crisis, which is really a trigger in respectfully to a whole numerous set of other crises, is it enough? That's one. And, is it enough in the context that it will encourage us? I don't want to say help us, but even just encourage us to overcome our egos.
I think it's an awakening, and in a lot of ways, what science has played a really important role in this COVID crisis. That sort of deductive understanding hasn't given us the predictive capacities to be able to manage the crisis. So it's highlighted both the importance of science, but also the limitations of science. Mm-hmm. But I still, from what I'm seeing around, the narratives, the prevailing public narratives, yes, this crisis is profound, and it's raising a lot of the issues that I'm talking about around the interdependencies and interconnections. I'm not seeing enough change at this stage. I think it will almost require some further dimensions to play out, whether it's the global financial system, the social inequality, the impact on the environment. This crisis that we have at the moment, to me, will just continue to build over time because of the way that we literally see the world. And I think one of the issues with this sort of scientism approach to solving our problems is that every time we solve a problem with science, we create these new externalities and new problems that need to be solved. So it becomes this perpetual loop of needing to upgrade our knowledge to do so. And maybe the answer to some of these issues is through simply asking different questions.
Very well said. Very well said. I don't know, Todd, I'll definitely feel free to jump in. I was going to throw out a thought experiment actually with Richard, but feel free to jump in.
There's so much here to unpack, and I really appreciate your thoughtful approach to laying this out for us, Richard. And I'm going to try to keep up. So, so you were talking a little bit about Peirce and abduction, deduction, or induction and deduction. I have to admit to a little stupidity. What do you mean by abduction? What does that actually? What does that mean?
Well, abduction's our capacity to it emerges through our experience, and it emerges through sense making. It emerges through bringing together a whole bunch of disparate ideas and coming up with a new way of trying to make sense of reality. So it's not this. If I think about Aristotelian logic, it goes very much along the lines of Richard's a man, all men live in Sydney, therefore Richard lives in Sydney. Now, what's incredible about that sort of idea is that the idea itself, the way of thinking, can be abstracted from the subject. So the whole idea of mathematics was actually built off those concepts. If you think about classical computing, it was based off that way of sort of seeing the world. It's a very powerful concept because it enables us to abstract it. But if we don't sort of integrate that abstraction with our experience, we end up in this sort of dystopian world. And there's a wonderful article, and I'm happy to share with your audience a series of articles that are related to today's conversation. But there's a wonderful article in the New York Times from, I think, about 2018. They interviewed a gentleman called Donald Knuth, who's the father of algorithms. He's one of the key people in Silicon Valley. He's the author of The Art of Computer Programming. And the last paragraph of the interview warns of the universal embracement of algorithms. He understands that there are limitations to algorithms, particularly if we don't update those algorithms. And, you know, other people like Norbert Wiener, the 1950s mathematician, philosopher, polymath that was one of the fathers of cybernetics, also worries about, you know, this universal embracement of algorithms. Because if we create this sort of algorithmic perspective of reality, computers are clearly far better placed to play a central role in that sort of world than we do, simply because of the, you know, the computational nature of computers. Now, the problem with that is that reality isn't simple, predictable, certain. And at some stage, you'll have this break. And over the last couple of decades in finance, there's been more and more algorithms used, you know, whether it's the capital asset pricing model, the Black-Scholes options pricing model, the Z-scores, the Sharpe ratio, algorithmic investing, passive exchange traded funds. So the whole sector has embraced this way of looking at reality. But what it's now done is that there's a concentration in risk. There's a correlation between risk, and there's an interdependency between all those risks. And I would actually argue that one of the things that we need to think about in terms of modern day risk management is have a more three-dimensional approach where we embrace algorithmic thinking, but we also embrace induction and abduction. And what I mean by induction, that could be everything from sense-making through to narratives, analogies, the way that we sort of make sense of realities through stories and making.
Sorry, yeah, that was exactly where I was kind of hoping to go. I just wanted to understand that, you know, what you meant by the side of it. I'm almost wondering, sort of, is this sort of more full dimensional thinking, more involved with going back to, or is it related to sort of trusting in intuition, or you know, ways of, you know, like non-logical ways of dealing with the world, like even almost back to sort of, you know, what was the roots of science, when magic and science were really kind of the same thing. Mm-hmm. That there were ways of observing the world very closely, but they weren't maybe so bound in the ways in which we've kind of bound ourselves up through deduction at this point.
Correct. So Nassim Taleb gave a speech, I think in 2016, 2017 at a risk conference. And he makes the comment that we need to listen to our grandmother's advice. Mm-hmm. You know, there's other thinking around. There's a book on practical wisdom. You know, through living, through our lived experience, mm-hmm. And that's where I think the way that we sort of think about knowledge needs to be more integral. That there is profound insight that we can gain through simply living. It's not all explicit. There's tacit knowledge that we can also benefit from. So it's more of an integrated way of sort of seeing reality, but also at the same time having this epistemological humility to recognize the limits of what we really know.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. That's great. So, sorry, Sai, you had a thought experiment.
No, all good, because it really throw this out as a sort of a thought experiment, Richard, and see what your perspective is on this. And I have to admit, some of it is a bit of a thought experiment, and I'm very, very openly, some of it is not a thought experiment. And the backdrop to that piece, when I say that, is my daughter, who's now in her mid-20s. At the time when we had her, again, 20 plus years ago, almost 26 years ago, I tend to be very erratic, for lack of better words. Very curious, and what I mean by erratic, extremely curious, and I lead with curiosity, and then am creative in the moment. So you can imagine sort of that scenario. And what I'm going to pose this as a question from a educational vantage point. If we take children and we don't coddle them, and we don't coddle them in terms of, hey, let's create a stable environment or what have you, but rather really take the opposite. Let's intentionally create instability that doesn't put them at risk or in harm's way, and let them cultivate the ability that becomes their normal. It would be a very different, I'm again posing this as a thought experiment. How different would they be? What are your thoughts on sort of starting on the other end of the spectrum in a sense?
Well, I mean, what's fascinating is that there's incredible insight. The psychologist Jean Piaget around early childhood development and the importance of experience and learning and curiosity and discovery. And that, in a lot of ways, Jean Piaget has a constructivism view of learning, which is it's innately part of the lived experience. It's one of the reasons why I think there's limitations to online learning. I think it's a combination of both. It's not simply just about online learning. But the point you raise is a really important point, because Jonathan Haidt has raised this issue time and time again around the coddling of the American mind.
Yeah.
And I've actually written an article about this called Hypernormalization. And it's based off the UK filmmaker Adam Curtis. And what we've done is we've created a world of certainty, knowing, and stability. A simple world when the world we inhabit is complex and dynamic and emergent. And he uses the analogy in this sort of interview that he gave, this podcast, that it felt like Russia in the mid-1980s. Everyone knew that there was something wrong with the system. The leaders knew there was something wrong with the system, but no one sort of challenged the orthodoxy. And I think, again, it's if we want to build an anti-fragile society and a resilient society, innovation, it's anchored in discovery, curiosity. I use the term hill climbers versus valley crossers. Hill climbing is all about optimization, efficiency. You've got a clear flag on the hill that you can aspire to. Valley crossing is all about failure, uncertainty, discovery, curiosity. What we've forgotten is that both reason, according to Charles Sanders Peirce, and knowledge, according to Jean Piaget, are anchored in discovery and valley crossing. And we've sort of created this sort of wall, this algorithmic wall that's moving further and further away from the world. And it's the antithesis of a society that can actually respond to increasing complexity and that multi-dimensionality. Because one of the other things a lot of what I talk about also integrates with some of the emergent technologies in computation, including artificial intelligence. And the way I see artificial intelligence, or particularly deep learning, is that it's finding patterns and manifolds in high-dimensional semantic abstraction. And with the emergence of the internet and this digital world, not only do we have a physical world and a mental world, but now we have a third world, which is this sort of digital world. So that dimensionality of abstraction on the mental side has increased by a power of two, a quantum power. And if we can't sort of reconcile, it's now a triangulation of reality that we need the capacity to do if we want to sort of maintain this world. And, you know, time and time again, I see a lot of artificial intelligence research where they're using abstract data. They're laying abstract data on abstract data. So there was an excellent article recently talking about bias in data. And what this team was doing was using GANs, these fake GANs, these fake images, to correct that bias. Mm-hmm. But that's fake data, instructing fake data to come up with algorithms. It's a mirror world, and we need to ensure there's a nexus or a relationship between our material world and our mental world.
Yeah, it's and I'm not by any means suggesting, hey, let's just create uncertainty for children, if you will, and especially, there's a balance. But I could imagine that as children, if children grew up with really embracing the uncertainty first, it would be a very different point of view. And I've experienced it with my own daughter. And when she was very young, my wife at the time used to say to me, "Si, step away from the child," because I would create uncertainty in an embracing, healthy way that really helped her become comfortable. So
the irony about this whole conversation is that what makes life interesting is the serendipity, is the uncertainty, is the curiosity, the capacity to learn and grow and try to make sense of the world. I mean, the least we need at this stage is a sort of Groundhog Day, a Bill Murray sort of Groundhog Day, where everything is known and everything's predictable. Yet we've sort of created this society that wants a Groundhog Day. And I think we need to liberate our kids and let them explore and let them discover and let them ask those questions and become these sort of lifelong learners. And that's an incredible place to be. That's about unleashing human potential, embracing diversity of perspectives, accepting that failure is part of it. There's a wonderful book by, he was the coach of a US gridiron team, Bill Walsh. I think he was coached the San Francisco 69ers. And his book's titled "The Score Will Take Care of Itself." Mm-hmm. So at no stage during his teaching or coaching of that gridiron team did he talk about the score on the weekends. He spoke about their behaviours, their relationships, their interdependencies. And then whatever happened on the weekend happened. Yet we've created modern day organisations that are focused on the next 3 months' results.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Richard, I call it being alive, because if you don't embrace that, you're literally dead. And I really want to kind of bring this sort of back to a little bit to the business world and kind of really look at the advice that you give leaders in the business world and what have you, is because children are conditioned respectfully that they become addicted to certainty, for lack of better words, and addicted to whatever this notion of normality is. Then we bring all these dysfunctions into the workplace, and then there's consultants and coaches that almost help them kind of refine themselves, in many ways. My good friend, what advice would you give to people and how they can leverage some of the multiple dimensionality that you're bringing forward and integrating?
I think it really goes back to those core axioms that I spoke about before. This idea that we can somehow predict the future. We can't. There is complexity, there is uncertainty. So if I'm thinking about large organizations, the message that you send to your teams is both explicit and implicit. If you have a team and every 3 months you're sitting down with that team after a performance update, you're very much sort of implying through that behavior a algorithmic way of seeing the world, that it's all very predictable and so forth. So we need leaders to really sort of accept the limits of knowing. I mean, there was a wonderful, there's an innovation group out of Europe that what they proposed was to take senior executives on a wine tasting course. And the reason they wanted to take these senior executives on wine tasting courses because it was all about the experience, and it was about describing their experience, sharing their experience. It's very difficult to quantify the experience of tasting a nice bottle of wine. Mm-hmm. And with all this stuff that I'm talking about, it's not one or the other. It's not this sort of binary. It's this duality. We still need rules and governance and so forth, but it's recognized the limitations of those approaches, and that the systems that we're inhabiting, the ground that we're standing on, is constantly shifting. The landscape is constantly shifting. So we need to be constantly testing our perspective of reality against that landscape. And you know, I used to have this sort of philosophy that if our customers are successful, we will be successful. Mm-hmm. It's this sort of symbiotic relationship. It's not one or the other. It's not about extraction. It's about shared value.
Yeah. Very, very powerful. Todd, I don't know if you had a thought. I can continue here on forever with Richard, quite honestly, but I want to leave space by all means to chime in if you have a thought to.
You're gracious as always, Sai. Thank you. But I was very content to just kind of hear what was going on. I was just reflecting as he was kind of talking about accepting the nimbleness of knowing, how he brought me back to my my graduate school days of studying John Milton and Paradise Lost. Where one of the angels is counseling Adam and Eve to know no more, the limits of knowledge, and that's a difficult thing for human beings to accept, because we think that's one of the things that makes us extra special. So it's intriguing for me to kind of think about that thought that you've given me a gloss on that text that I hadn't thought about in quite some years. So thank you for that.
That's okay. There's a wonderful book by, I think it's Hermann Hesse, and I might be getting this wrong, but I think it's The Glass Bead Game.
Yeah.
And it's the culmination of a life of wisdom. And he wrote this book about the glass bead game, and it talks about this sort of search for trying to understanding and embracing different ideas and so forth. But there's a bit of a sting in the tail at the end of the book. Because again, it's what he's saying is that it's not just about the abstraction. It's not knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It's how do you then apply that knowledge in a complex, dynamic world. And again, it sort of goes back to this sort of duality. And that's why I truly believe that we're moving from a classical to a quantum world of entanglement. We are interconnected and interdependent, and it's really starting to recognize that. And if the human race is going to navigate the 21st century, whether it's the geopolitics, whether it's the economics, the financial system, the social systems, we need to bring back that sort of narrative. There's a wonderful article in the New York Times by David Brooks on Anthony Kennedy and the privatization of meaning. Mm. And what we've done is, through focusing on the I versus we, one of the issues we have is that everything becomes relativistic. There's no foundation stones to build a society. We all have our own beliefs and perspectives. Now, if every one of us has our own beliefs and perspectives, what we all need to do is read the classics and read philosophy and so forth. But a lot of us don't have that capacity to try to make sense of that reality and form that view. And the sort of the other paradox of that is that the more we have this sort of fraction, this atomization of society, the more that government has to intervene through rules and regulations to hold the fabric together. When historically a lot of that social contract or social fabric was implicit versus explicit. So it's the duality. We all need our personal freedoms, but at the same time, we also need to recognise that we're part of a community and part of a system.
Very well said. So I'll tell you, Richard, I've had the honor of watching respectfully your work kind of really enter the public space more visibly, for lack of any other description. So I've been very fortunate. I consider myself fortunate to have stumbled upon you and had that opportunity. What's next? I mean, where do you see you channeling your energy, over the next year, over the next few years? I'm very, very interested.
Well, the reason I'm doing this, I was previously the head of innovation for a major financial institution, and one of the core issues with innovation is that you need to embrace uncertainty. It's all about embracing uncertainty and ambiguity and harnessing people's potential. And since leaving that organisation, I've had to embrace that uncertainty. It was almost a paradox in the previous role, that I was in that role, but there was a level of certainty. Whereas now I'm having to embrace that uncertainty. Since the emergence of the virus, I've struggled a bit from working from home. I really do need that that sort of social connection with other people and so forth. So I don't subscribe to this idea that we're all going to be online, digitally connected, and in this sort of digital world, because I think sense making requires face-to-face contact with people and so forth. So the intent is to sort of continue this journey. What's been encouraging is that this conversation is very much global, and it's very much emergent. So there are people that I deal with in Brazil, or in the Netherlands, or in Denmark, or in Canada, or in the US, and people are just self-selecting out of this. It's coming up through the drain pipes. It's an emergent sort of phenomenon, and I think that's all it can be. So, when we start putting too much structure around this way of thinking about things, it sort of concerns me. And the other thing that sort of concerns me, it's not about a revolution,
Mm-hmm.
it's more of an evolution. And I think part of the evolution is this inner development work that we do. So there's some wonderful insights coming out of some of the Scandinavian countries. Lena Anderson and Thomas Bjorkman have written a book called The Nordic Secret.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about the importance of inner development to navigate the world. So they use the example of the Industrial Revolution and how some of the Scandinavian countries just weren't equipped for this new world. And they embraced the philosophy of a German philosopher. It was Bildung. I don't think the Germans really embraced it, but the Scandinavian countries did. And it was that sort of inner work that you need to do. And what sort of concerns me at the moment is that we've got these incredible tools, these deep learning neural nets, and the fact that we can have a conversation in real time when we're sitting on opposite sides of the globe. I think these are incredible tools. But it's analogous to a Formula One racing car that we've built, this incredibly technologically advanced racing car, but we haven't actually invested in driver training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
The more that we can sort of have these conversations and bring together these divergent views and share insights and so forth, the better equipped we'll be. But I truly believe that at the core of this is a shift beyond Cartesian dualism, is the first one. So accepting these two worlds, the mental world and the material world, and how they're sort of interconnected through the semantic network of ideas and things. And I think the second one is this sort of different way of logic. So rather than sort of think about Aristotle and this sort of abstract deductive logic, let's embrace Charles Sanders Peirce, starting with abduction and the experience and then working backwards. But realizing that whatever we do, whatever algorithm or heuristic that we come up with will always be tentative. A fallibilism view of knowledge, that there's a little asterisk in the corner, subject to upgrades.
Yes. Yes, very well said. Very well said. Well, I'll tell you, especially you mentioned Hermann Hesse and all his work. I mean, all around his stories and what have you are very powerful to really reveal the human element. So definitively, that's icing on the cake for me. I'll put it that way. So I thank you for that. And I know we've taken a good amount of your time. I'm optimistic that you will do more with us as we continue the journey around catalyzing the future. Especially, I think there's a lot of opportunity ahead in terms of bringing, great perspectives and wisdom to the world.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Thank you. So, Sai, I think maybe this is a good time for us to wrap things up.
Definitely. Thank you again, Richard. Tremendously appreciated.
Yeah. And thank you, those of you who are joining us, on the live broadcast, or if you catch us on the replay. We would love to hear from you and to hear your reflections on the conversation and Richard's ideas that came up today. There was a wealth of knowledge and new thinking, and I know I've got my reading list for the next year of some books to check out, because there was a lot there that was really good and new to me. Again, if you haven't already, please like and follow us on Facebook and YouTube, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments section. The micro workshops day of training is coming up on December the 9th. It will be throughout the day, 3 separate tracks of multiple micro workshop opportunities. You can sign up for those, learn more about them at catalyzingthefuture.com. With that, Sai, I think we're out, and we'll thank Richard once again for coming and spending some time with us today, and hope to see him again soon.
Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you again very soon.